Utah and Grant County and San Juan. They dig the yellow stuff that makes the atom bomb. They do the uranium miners boogie. The uranium miners boogie. It's the uranium miners boogie. They digging all day long.
You are listening to Men in Lead Aprons. Everything you might want to know about radiation, the good, the bad, and the not yet known. This is a regular podcast from the Columbia University Center for Radiological Research from the heart of New York City. And here are your hosts, Dr. Eric Hall and Dr. David Brenner.
Welcome to the Men in Lead Aprons, a series of podcasts from the Center for Radiological Research at Columbia University in New York City. These podcasts are going to focus on the many different aspects of radiation in our everyday lives, what is good, what is bad, and what is simply not yet known. My name is Eric Hall, and for 25 years I was director of the Center for Radiological Research. And my fellow man in lead aprons is David Brenner, who is the current director. Just a word here about the Center for Radiological Research. It was founded exactly 100 years ago by Gino Failla, who was a graduate student of the great pioneer Marie Curie, and we've been studying and teaching here the biological effects of radiation ever since. Now let me introduce my fellow man in lead aprons, David Brenner. So, David, what do we mean when we talk about the good, the bad, and the not yet known? What is good? What is bad about radiation? And what is not yet known?
Well, good morning, Eric. And yes, indeed, we come across radiation in all sorts of different areas in our everyday lives. And we will be talking much about all of these in our future podcasts. We'll be talking about radiation in the medical world, from X-rays to CT scanners to radiotherapy. We'll be talking about nuclear power in all its aspects. We'll be talking about X-ray scanners in airports. We'll be talking about radon gas in our basement. We'll be talking about the radiations from cell phones. We'll even be taking you on a trip to Mars.
So that's the good. What about the bad and the not yet known?
Well, it's absolutely true that radiation is very much a two-edged sword, with the potential for doing us a great deal of good, but also the potential for harm. So the trick, and that's what you'll hear much about in these podcasts upcoming, is to make sure that we get all the benefits we can while minimizing any potential harm. And I'll give you just one example to start with. In the medical world, it's just impossible to imagine any part of medicine without X-rays, and particularly these days without CT scans. But the downside of radiation is that radiation does cause cancer. Before you start to panic here, low doses of radiation, like in an X-ray, increase our cancer risks by only a very small amount. And of course, there are very few things that we do in our daily lives that are totally without risk. If we drive a car, fly an aeroplane, drink wine, eat a nice steak, go swimming, all the good things in life, they all have risks associated with them. But what we do is that we balance subconsciously the risks and the benefits of all these things and decide when the benefits come out on top, and those are the things we do. And it's pretty well the same for every aspect of radiation.
So that's the good and the bad. What about the not yet known?
Indeed, the not yet known. Well, here's the thing about radiation, particularly when we're thinking about low doses of radiation, very often the risks are not very well known. We do know that the risks, when the doses are small, the risks are small, but we don't really know just exactly how small. And we'll be talking in future podcasts about the controversies that are still raging today about this.
So are you telling me that we still don't know after 100 years of research?
It's true. And again, we'll talk in future podcasts about why that is. I agree, it's pretty extraordinary.
So why don't we give our listeners just a brief flavor today of what's to come in our Men in Lead Aprons podcasts in future weeks. Let's start off in the hospital.
Okay, well, actually there are two very different uses of radiation in a hospital setting. One is CT scans and X-rays in general that we've just talked about. And as I said, there's no question that CT has completely revolutionized the way that medical practice operates. CT scans have meant more effective surgical treatments, have meant more shorter hospital stays. We can eliminate an awful lot of exploratory surgeries that we used to have to do. And certainly from the point of view of cancer, better diagnosis and better treatment. And if you break a limb, more efficient treatment after injury, better treatment after a stroke, better treatment after after heart conditions. So CT has had an enormous impact, and all for the good. But as we're going to discuss, I mean, there are radiation risks involved in CT, and really we have to think about the risks and the benefits. And in general, I would say that the benefits of a CT scan, if you need a CT scan, absolutely outweigh any small radiation risks. So that's one arm of radiation in the hospital, and that's X-rays and CT scans. The other is for cancer treatment, and that's cancer radiation therapy or radiotherapy. And right now, if in the unfortunate situation that you're diagnosed with cancer, you've got about a 50% chance that you're going to be treated with radiation therapy. So that's a pretty high chance. So an awful lot of people are treated with radiation therapy. The most common cancers of all, breast cancer and prostate cancer, both very commonly treated with radiation therapy, sometimes in combination with other modalities like surgery. But radiation therapy is a fundamental part of what we have available to us to treat cancer, and it's generally a very effective treatment. And again, we're going to talk about that a great deal as we progress through these podcasts.
All right, so that's the hospital. Let's move now to the airport.
Yeah, so the airport. Everybody who's gone through any airport in the past decade or so knows that you have to go through multiple levels of security. And one of the main levels of security up till a couple of years ago was the X-ray whole body scanner. If you recall, in this country, in the USA, they were a couple of blue boxes, and you walked in between them and stood there for a moment or two. Now, those were whole body X-ray scanners, and there was some radiation dose, and therefore, we believe, some small radiation risk associated with that. It was a very small dose, and it was a very small risk. But nevertheless, those scanners are no longer in use either in Europe or the USA. And now we have what are called millimeter wave scanners in their place, which are basically using the same sorts of radiations that are in your microwave oven, but at a much, much lower level. Interestingly, while they're gone in Europe and they're gone in this country, the TSA has made some noises that they're going to bring back the X-ray scanners in the USA, and that's something that we'll talk about in future podcasts.
I'm sure we'll have to discuss nuclear power at some point, David.
We'll certainly be talking a lot about nuclear power, Eric, in its various manifestations. So, of course, we're still only a few years on from the Fukushima accident in Japan, and before that, an even bigger accident, the Chernobyl accident in the old Soviet Union. So there are risks and benefits associated with nuclear power, and we're going to talk a lot about those. I mean, the benefits are pretty clear. It's an unlimited source of power, and it also avoids having to use carbon fuels, which we all know are associated with which we all know are associated with global warming and so on. So there are definitely upsides to nuclear power, but the downsides, of course, are to do with the potential for accidents like at Fukushima, like at Chernobyl, and a very much smaller accident in this country at 3 Mile Island. And there are other downsides too in terms of this spent nuclear fuel, which at the moment we don't know what to do with, so we have to store in swimming pools for years and years and years. So there are ups and downs associated with nuclear power, and it'll certainly be one of our themes to try and figure out, well, what are the risks and what are the benefits, and how to balance those.
Lots of questions I'd like to ask you about that, but for the present, let's move back home and into the basement. Assuming we've got a house with a basement, what are we talking about now?
Well, if we're talking about basements and we're talking about radiation, we're talking about radon. So radon is something that not everybody knows about, but actually is probably the biggest source of radiation exposure that any of us get in our everyday lives. So radon is a naturally occurring radioactive gas which comes out of rocks and soils and seeps through cracks in rocks and soils to the surface, to the surface of the ground. And if your house happens to be built on some rocks which have a lot of uranium and therefore radon in it, well, your radon can build up in your basement and can actually become a hazard. The risks of radon are breathing in radon gas, and subsequently there is a risk of lung cancer associated with that. Now, it's a pretty easy fix, in fact. All you've got to do is ventilate your basement. But of course you need to know that there's a problem in the first place, so you need to be able to test your basement to see if you've got radon gas. Now, I live in Manhattan on the 11th floor of an apartment building, so I don't have a radon problem because by the time the gas reaches the 11th floor, there isn't very much of it. So it really is an issue only for people who have basements and only for people who live in certain areas of the United States where there's particularly granite rocks under your house.
I feel my cell phone is vibrating away in my pocket, but before I put it to my ear, close to my brain, let me ask, are we going to talk about the radiation from cell phones?
Well, we certainly are, and that's certainly one of the most common questions that we get asked. Are cell phones safe? It's certainly a different type of radiation than we've talked about so far. It's not X-ray type radiation, but it certainly is radiation. And one of our podcasts is going to be on the radiation from cell phones, from cordless phones, from overhead power lines, from microwaves, and so on. So most people would say that they're entirely safe, but not everybody. It's still a controversial topic, and it's something that we'll talk about.
So just for a moment, let's talk about one aspect of radiation that, as far as I can see, doesn't have any upside at all. And that's the possibility of radiological terrorism.
Well, I'd certainly agree with you that radiological terrorism has no upside whatsoever, but it is something that we need to think about and be prepared for, because, as we'll talk about, it really isn't potentially very hard for the bad guys to get hold of some radiological material and set off what we call a dirty bomb. Actually, there are two types of radiological terrorism that we'll be thinking about. One is the real big one. What if some terrorists could actually set off an atomic explosion, a nuclear weapon in a big city? Now, that's technologically a pretty hard thing to do and probably pretty unlikely. But the consequences, of course, would be absolutely calamitous. I mean, if you recall the movies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that would be the consequence, and that's, as I say, almost unimaginable. What's more imaginable is, as I say, what's called a dirty bomb, which is not to actually set off a nuclear weapon, but just to find some nuclear material and blow it up. And that's certainly possible, and we think a lot about, well, how can we prepare ourselves for that sort of event?
So I was wondering, David, have you seen the new movie The Martian, where Matt Damon gets stranded on Mars for several years? Now, some people say that the worst problem he will have, but not the only problem, is radiation. What do you think?
Well, I have seen the movie, and I must say I would recommend it to you and to our listeners. Not bad at all. But you're right about the issue of radiation, which doesn't get that much of a mention in the movie. So he gets stranded on Mars. I don't want to give the plot away for those who haven't seen it, for several years, for 5 years or so. And the thing about going outside the protective atmosphere of the Earth is that any space explorer is subject to increased levels of radiation. And that's because there is a lot of radiation out there in space. We on Earth are shielded from that radiation, both by the Earth's atmosphere and also by various magnetic forces which bend radiations away from the Earth. But once we're outside the protective region around the Earth, even if we're just orbiting around the Earth, we're exposed to significant amounts of radiation. And interestingly, there are different types of radiation from the sorts of radiation that we get here on Earth. They're not generally X-rays. They're different types of radiation exposure. And they're types of radiation exposure that we don't really know a lot about. And so it's pretty hard for us to estimate what the risks might be. Though, as we'll talk about in a future podcast, we're trying very hard to do just that, to figure out what are the radiation risks from the radiations out there in space.
Well, thank you for that, David. I think our time is running out for this first podcast. In it, we've tried to give you a flavor for the subjects that we plan to talk about in future podcasts. Apart from having some fun and telling some interesting stories, our real goal is for you, our listeners, to be able to make the best decisions you can when it comes to radiation. For example, should I or my child have a CT scan? Should I willingly go through the scanner at the airport? What should be my position on nuclear power? Should I worry about the radiation from my cell phone or the radon in my basement? And much, much more. So tune in to the next podcast from the men in Lead Aprons, and we start to unravel the full story of radiation, the good, the bad, and the not yet known.